Is the Democratic representative from the United States Virgin Islands, Stacey Plaskett. She's a member of the Judiciary and Intelligence Committee. She's also previously served as an impeachment manager during the second impeachment of Donald Trump. And importantly, she worked for the Department of Justice. So, Congresswoman Plaskett, you know a lot about the various aspects of this case. Let's go right to the beginning. The idea that Donald Trump says he was tried by the House of Representatives and then not convicted by the Senate, which means he's already been through this, and it would be double jeopardy to try him again. Plus, he maintains that he's got immunity because he was the president about things that he did while he was president. What's your take?
Well, I mean, talk about throw everything against the wall and see if anything sticks. But what he's throwing against the wall is, of course, nonsense. The House has a duty to impeach when there are high crimes and misdemeanors, which the House did, which is absolutely separate from what has happened to him on Ali in the judiciary. And so that is a separate system, and he will be tried in that system. That is not double jeopardy, because what happened in the House and the Senate are not related to our judiciary branch. As for his having immunity, that is something that only a president can give during the time of their presidency. And President Joe Biden, who is the lawful president at this time, says that he being Donald Trump, is not immune from being convicted for the crimes that he has had. And so the court will rule. We hope that the court will rule according to the law, and the trial will move on. I think that Jack Smith has been brilliant in bringing a lot of these matters forward so that we can get them out of the way and the trial can begin, so that the American people can have some clear understanding as to who the candidate is that they are going to be going to the ballot to determine who to vote for.
I want to talk about some of the things that Donald Trump has said recently. He recently said he wants to be a dictator, but just for a day. However, during a rally last night in New Hampshire, he repeatedly referenced his close relationship with some autocratic world leaders. Listen to this.
Has anybody ever heard of Vladimir Putin? Of Russia, says that Biden's, and this is a quote, politically motivated persecution of his political rival is very good for Russia because it shows the rottenness of the American political system, which cannot pretend to teach others about democracies. Viktor Orban, the highly respected prime minister of Hungary, said, Trump is the man who can save the Western world. It was like a rocket ship sent by Kim Jong-un, just like that. Who was very nice, I will tell you. You know, everyone thought we were going to nuclear war, and I got in, and he and I had a very good relationship. That was nice.
Some weird stuff. Of all the people in the world who you could use as references for yourself, he chose Putin, Orban, and Kim Jong-un. And this is in addition to sort of some racist things that he's been saying. He's been using the idea that immigration will poison the blood of our nation, which is remarkably similar to language that that Adolf Hitler used to use. What do you make of all of this?
I make that Trump is telling us who he is. And it's up to us as the American people to have the sense to accept what an individual says about themselves. Trump, as you said during that Saturday rally, also talked about frighteningly giving police officers absolute immunity, which puts just a mark on the back of every person who has had fear of police. You know, I think of my black sons. I think of all of the African Americans, Mexicans, who the president has said he's going after, individuals who do not look like himself. And that is something that we in this country, black and white, should not stand for. This president is going to take us back if he were to get back in office. Trump is saying out loud what he thinks. And we, as the American people, need to put it on loop and remind ourselves that if he should be reelected, he is only going to do far worse than he did in his first term.
Because I have you here and because of your deep legal experience, I want to ask you about some of the legal matters facing the president. He and his team are intent on delaying his criminal cases as long as possible, which is odd because generally speaking in the criminal justice system, you have a constitutional right to a speedy trial, and most people would like to have a speedy trial. The federal election interference case, the Jack Smith case, is paused for now. Could still proceed as planned on March 4th. A lot of experts I've talked to have said it's probably going to be delayed a little bit. But how important is it to you that that case, meaning for our democracy, that case and or the Georgia case, both of which deal with similar matter, happened before the election?
I think they're all really important. You know, we haven't talked a lot about the classified materials case, the possession of reams of classified materials after he left office. But for the fact that we have such an unstable judge who's handling that matter, I would think that that should be something that the American people would look at as well. But of course, the matter that's in Georgia in the state court, as well as the federal case in Washington, D.C., related to the ultimate and high crimes and misdemeanors of an individual, that being the attempted overthrow of the peaceful transfer of power, is something that we should all be looking at and should be right on the table for individuals as they go into the ballot box. You know, while all of this is going on, you've seen that we have a Congress that is, the House Republicans are lockstep with this president in his nonsense. We have not passed any major legislation, but all they've done is allowed Trump to call them out and the hounds, the jackals, to obstruct the work of our legislature, whether it be in not passing laws, whether it be in removing individuals and their own speaker, or in this, you know, impeachment in search of a crime that they're now putting on President Joe Biden.
Congresswoman, good to see you as always. Thank you for being with us. Representative Stacey Plaskett, Democrat from the United States Virgin Islands. All right, coming up.